The German soldiers called it the sound of a witch's broom. A soft whooshing in the darkness, just above the trees. No engine noise, no radar signature, no warning. And then the bombs fell. By the time you heard them, it was already too late. The Germans called them Nachthexen, the night witches. It was meant as an insult. The women who earned that name wore it like a badge of honor. They were the pilots of the Soviet 588th Night Bomber Regiment, an all-female unit that flew over 23,000 combat missions during the Second World War. Every pilot, every navigator, every mechanic, every member of every ground crew was a woman. Most of them were teenagers. On June 22, 1941, Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in human history. Over 3 million German soldiers poured across the Soviet border. Within months, Leningrad was under siege, Moscow was threatened, and the Red Army was hemorrhaging soldiers at a rate that threatened total collapse. The Soviet Union was desperate, and desperate times called for something no military had tried before. Her name was Marina Raskova, and she was already a legend. Known as the Russian Amelia Earhart, she had set multiple world records for long-distance flight. She was one of the most famous women in the Soviet Union, and in the fall of 1941, she was receiving thousands of letters from women across the country. Women who wanted to fly, who wanted to fight, and who were furious that the Soviet Air Force wouldn't let them. Raskova used her personal relationship with Joseph Stalin to do something no one else could. On October 8, 1941, she secured an order to create 3 all-female aviation regiments. Pilots, navigators, mechanics, ground crews, every position filled by women. Nothing like it had ever been done. Here's the part that makes this story extraordinary. The women were sorted by skill level. The best pilots went to the fighter regiment and got brand new Yakovlev fighters. The middle tier went to the bomber regiment. And the ones who scored lowest, the least experienced, the youngest, the ones nobody expected much from, were assigned to the 588th Night Bomber Regiment. They were given a plane nobody else wanted to fly, the Polikarpov Po-2. It was a biplane from 1928, made of plywood and canvas, open cockpit, no heat, no radar, no radio, no guns, no parachutes. A top speed of about 60 miles per hour when loaded, slower than the stalling speed of a German fighter. The women called it a coffin with wings. They weren't welcome. Male pilots treated them as a joke. They were given used uniforms and boots that didn't fit. Their commanding officers doubted they could handle combat. One pilot later recalled that the men didn't like the little girls going to the front line. It was a man's thing. The women had to prove themselves not just against the Germans, but against their own military. And they did. The 588th deployed to the front lines in June 1942. Their mission: fly nighttime harassment and precision bombing raids against German positions. The tactic was brilliant in its simplicity. They flew in groups of 3. The first 2 planes would approach the target and deliberately attract German searchlights. While the anti-aircraft guns targeted the decoys, the third plane would cut its engine, glide silently toward the target, and drop its bombs. That whooshing sound, the sound of canvas wings slicing through the night air, was the only warning the Germans ever got. Then the planes would swap roles and do it again. Each plane could carry only 2 bombs, roughly 770 pounds of ordnance. That meant one run was never enough. So the women flew 8, 10, sometimes 18 missions in a single night. Each sortie lasted 30 to 50 minutes. They would land, refuel, reload the bombs by hand, and take off again, and again, and again. Some nights, a single crew would fly until dawn. In winter, the temperatures in the open cockpit dropped so low that the metal parts of the aircraft would tear skin off anyone who touched them bare-handed. There was no heated gear. There were no enclosed cabins. Just 2 women in an open biplane, in the dark, in the Russian winter, flying directly into German anti-aircraft fire. Nadezhda Popova, Nadia to everyone who knew her, was one of the regiment's most decorated pilots. She flew 852 missions over the course of the war. On one mission, she returned to base with 42 bullet holes in her plane. 42. And she went back up that same night. She later said that she sometimes flew so many missions in a row that she would fall asleep the moment her plane landed, and her navigator would have to shake her awake to fly the next one. When asked years later about fear, she said, "I sometimes stare into the blackness and close my eyes. I can still imagine myself as a young girl, up there in my plane, all alone, flying into the dark." 32 members of the regiment were killed during the war. 32 women who volunteered to fly plywood planes into enemy fire night after night for 3 years. Some were shot down by anti-aircraft guns. Others died when their canvas planes caught fire, which happened almost instantly because wood and canvas burn. There were no ejection seats. For most of the war, there were no parachutes. When your plane was hit, you had seconds to decide what to do. Most of the time, there was nothing to decide. Over the course of 1,100 nights of active combat, the Night Witches flew more than 23,000 sorties. They dropped over 3,000 tons of bombs and 26,000 incendiary shells on German targets. They destroyed ammunition depots, supply lines, railways, bridges, and fuel stores. They kept entire German divisions awake, exhausted, and terrified of the dark. The Nazis feared them so much that any German pilot who shot down a Night Witch was automatically awarded the Iron Cross, one of Germany's highest military honors. That's how seriously they took these women in their plywood planes. The 588th Night Bomber Regiment became the most highly decorated female unit in the entire Soviet Air Force. They were awarded the Guards designation, a rare honor reserved for the most distinguished military units. 23 of their members received the title Hero of the Soviet Union, the highest honor in the country. They had started as the rejects, the least experienced, the ones nobody believed in. They ended the war as legends. And then the war ended. And here's where the story turns. When the Soviet Union held its massive victory parade in Moscow, the Night Witches were not invited. The reason? Their planes were too slow. The women who had flown over 23,000 combat missions in plywood biplanes, who had earned the most decorations of any female unit in the Soviet military, who had terrorized the German army for 3 years, were told they couldn't march in the parade because their aircraft weren't impressive enough. 6 months after the war ended, the regiment was disbanded. The women went home. For decades, the Night Witches faded from memory. The Soviet Union, despite its wartime reliance on women soldiers, quietly returned to traditional gender roles after the war. Female veterans were discouraged from talking about their combat experience. The story of the 588th, one of the most remarkable military units in the history of warfare, was slowly buried under layers of silence and indifference. Most of the world had never heard of them. It wasn't until decades later that their story began to resurface. Books, documentaries, and eventually a novel, Kate Quinn's The Huntress, published in 2019, brought the Night Witches back into public consciousness. Nadia Popova, who had flown 852 missions, lived long enough to see the world rediscover what she and her sisters had done. She died in 2013 at the age of 91. By then, she had become the most famous Night Witch in history, the face of a regiment that had refused to be forgotten. Think about what these women did. They were given the worst equipment, the most dangerous assignment, and the least respect. They flew open cockpit biplanes made of plywood and canvas into enemy fire, night after night, in sub-zero temperatures, with no parachutes and no guns. They flew more missions than almost any other unit in the Soviet Air Force. And then they were told their planes were too slow for the victory parade. That's not just a war story. That's a story about what happens when people are underestimated, and what happens when they refuse to accept it. The Germans gave them a name meant to frighten and demean. The Night Witches took that name and made it immortal. 23,000 missions, 3,000 tons of bombs, 1,100 nights of combat. All of it flown by women who were told they didn't belong in the sky. That's why we tell these stories. Because the most extraordinary people in history are often the ones who were never supposed to be there. If this story moved you, subscribe. Because in our next episode, we're telling the story of the good doctor of Auschwitz, the only Nazi staff member acquitted at trial, defended by the very prisoners he was supposed to destroy.